During the Second World War, there were places in the United States that appeared, almost overnight, on the edges of ordinary maps and ordinary lives. Roads were extended, rail lines were laid, cafeterias opened, schools took in children. Workers lined up for shifts, collected paychecks, wrote letters home, and tried to make sense of rules that followed them from the factory gate to the post office window. But these were not ordinary towns. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, at Hanford, Washington, and at Los Alamos, New Mexico, the United States built 3 wartime communities around one of the most guarded military secrets in American history. Their residents lived behind fences, passes, checkpoints, censored addresses, guard towers, and habits of silence. They lived inside a contradiction. Daily life was made as normal as possible, while the purpose of that life was hidden from nearly everyone who performed it. The Manhattan Project would eventually employ about 130,000 workers at its peak, and by the end of the war, it had spent about $2.2 billion, according to the Department of Energy. Yet for many of those workers, the project did not arrive as a grand scientific enterprise. It arrived as a job. It arrived as a construction assignment, a clerical position, a laboratory posting, a security order, a military transfer, or a chance to contribute to important war work without being told exactly what the work was. That was the first architecture of the atomic age. Not the reactor, not the laboratory, not the bomb assembly building, but the fence. The fence separated the visible from the known. On one side were farms, towns, rivers, mesas, and roads. On the other side were entire systems of production that depended on secrecy as much as they depended on electricity, water, uranium, graphite, silver, explosives, and skilled labor. The people inside could see the buildings rising. They could feel the strain of long shifts. They could hear the warnings about loose talk. But most were allowed to understand only a narrow strip of the whole. At Oak Ridge, in East Tennessee, the mission was uranium-enrichment. The city was built about 20 miles west of Knoxville, in a valley and ridge landscape between the Appalachian Mountains and the Cumberland Plateau. The site was first known as the Kingston Demolition Range and later as the Clinton Engineer Works. Behind that official language grew the largest of the 3 main Manhattan Project communities. It contained the Y-12 electromagnetic separation plant, the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant, and the S-50 liquid thermal diffusion plant. These names were plain, almost anonymous, but they marked some of the most ambitious industrial operations of the war. For workers there, secrecy entered through routine. A person might operate a dial, monitor a gauge, move material, type a form, or guard a road, and still not be told what the plant ultimately produced. The work was divided into compartments, and each compartment could be explained as a task, not a weapon. That was the genius and the burden of the system. It allowed tens of thousands of people to build toward a single result without being invited into the whole story. At Hanford, along the Columbia River in Washington, the mission was plutonium production. The government acquired land there in early 1943, displacing residents of White Bluffs, Hanford, Richland, and smaller communities. Area tribes were also barred from returning to traditional use lands. The scale of the site was immense. The National Park Service describes the Hanford site as roughly 600 square miles, while another National Park Service site selection account describes General Leslie R. Groves acquiring 780 square miles along the Columbia River. Hanford was not just a factory. It was an engineered landscape of reactors, chemical processing areas, fuel fabrication, roads, railroads, workers' camps, and a reshaped community at Richland. Its wartime task was to irradiate uranium fuel rods in nuclear reactors and then use chemical processes to extract plutonium from the irradiated uranium. But that explanation was not the explanation most workers carried with them. The official Hanford site history states that employees often knew little to nothing beyond the belief that they were doing important war work. That belief mattered. It helped people endure secrecy. It made the unknown feel patriotic rather than merely suspicious. In wartime America, not knowing could be framed as service. Silence could be loyalty. Los Alamos was different again. Its mission was weapons research. Located on a mesa in New Mexico, it became the laboratory where scientists, engineers, technicians, military personnel, and families lived under the pressure of theory becoming machinery. New arrivals often passed through 109 East Palace Avenue in Santa Fe, where Dorothy Scarrett McKibben issued passes and directed them to the mesa known as the Hill. The mailing address was not Los Alamos in the ordinary way. During the Manhattan Project, the community used P.O. Box 1663 in Santa Fe as a central address. The Atomic Heritage Foundation states that babies born there had P.O. Box 1663 listed as birthplace on birth certificates. That detail is small, but it tells the larger story. Even birth had to pass through the machinery of secrecy. A child's first official location could be a post office box. Across these places, the government did not simply hide a project. It hid cities. People shopped, ate, slept, married, raised children, attended school, and stood in lines under rules designed to conceal the reason those cities existed. A pass could decide where a person could go. A fence could define the boundary of knowledge. A censored address could turn a family letter into a military object. A guard tower could overlook not only a road, but a civic experiment, how to create a complete community while withholding its purpose. The secrecy was not accidental. It was operational. It shaped employment, housing, transportation, communication, and even social conversation. Workers were warned not to ask too many questions. They were often discouraged from discussing their duties with neighbors, friends, or spouses. What one person knew, another did not. What one building did, another building depended on, but the connection might remain invisible to the people inside both. This is the central question that follows the Manhattan Project's secret cities. How could so many people help build a weapon without knowing the full purpose of their work? The answer begins with scale and division. The project was too large to be hidden in a single room, so it was hidden in plain sight across guarded landscapes. It needed power, water, land, roads, housing, and food service. It needed chemists and machinists, physicists and typists, construction crews and security guards. It needed people who could perform one piece of a process precisely, repeatedly, and urgently. Most did not need to know the final design. In fact, from the point of view of military secrecy, it was safer if they did not. But secrecy did not make life weightless. It made life strange. Imagine a city where the school day, the factory shift, the bus route, and the cafeteria meal all seem familiar, yet the reason for the city itself remains unspoken. Imagine living behind a fence and being told that the work is important, but not being told why. Imagine knowing that the war is everywhere, that sons and husbands and brothers are overseas, that rationing and sacrifice are national facts, and that your own contribution may be decisive, though its meaning is withheld from you. That was life behind the atomic fence. Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos were not interchangeable. Each had its own geography, its own labor force, its own social order, and its own form of secrecy. Oak Ridge grew into a vast industrial city for separating uranium isotopes. Hanford turned river water, hydroelectric power, and remote acreage into an industrial system for plutonium dempertate. Los Alamos gathered weapons research on a mesa, reached through Santa Fe and guarded by passes, addresses, and military control. Together, they formed a hidden national machine. To understand that machine, it is not enough to begin with the bomb. We have to begin with the places that made it possible: the valleys, the river corridor, the mesa, the acquired land, the removed communities, the power lines, the gates, and the decisions that placed each secret city where it was. The fence around the war was physical, but it was also geographic. It followed the logic of distance, resources, concealment, and command. And at the center of that logic was the officer assigned in September of 1942 to turn an urgent scientific possibility into a functioning wartime system: General Leslie R. Groves. General Leslie R. Groves entered the story at the point where scientific possibility had to become geography. By September of 1942, the work that would become the Manhattan Project could no longer exist only in laboratories, memoranda, and guarded conversations. It needed land. It needed roads, rail access, construction crews, electric power, water, housing, and military authority. It needed places large enough to hold machines that had barely been tested, remote enough to hide a new industrial war effort, and connected enough to operate at wartime speed. That was the contradiction Groves inherited. The project had to be concealed from the public, from enemy intelligence, and often from its own workers. But concealment did not mean smallness. The Manhattan Project would become one of the largest wartime engineering efforts in American history, employing about 130,000 workers at its peak and costing about $2.2 billion by the end of the war, according to the Department of Energy. Its secrecy depended not on invisibility, but on control. Control of territory, control of movement, control of information, and control of the landscapes where production could be broken into separate parts. Groves was not choosing scenery. He was approving a hidden geography. The three primary wartime centers, Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos, were not interchangeable. Each place matched a specific problem inside the larger race to build an atomic weapon. Oak Ridge in East Tennessee was suited to uranium enrichment. Hanford in Washington was suited to industrial-scale plutonium production. Los Alamos in New Mexico was suited to weapons research, design, and assembly. Their locations tell us what the project needed most: power for separation plants, water for reactors, isolation for hazardous operations, and a secure laboratory community where scientific teams could be gathered under military rule. Oak Ridge came first in this geography of decision. Approved on September 19, 1942, it lay about 20 miles west of Knoxville in a valley and ridge landscape between the Appalachian Mountains and the Cumberland Plateau. That landscape mattered. Ridges could divide facilities from one another. Valleys could hold roads, housing, and plants. The surrounding countryside offered enough space for a wartime reservation, but it was not so remote that construction would become impossible. Just as important, Oak Ridge sat near the electrical world being built by the Tennessee Valley Authority. Uranium enrichment required immense amounts of power. The project needed electricity not as an accessory, but as a condition of existence. At Oak Ridge, the government could connect the hidden work of isotope separation to the hydroelectric capacity of nearby Tennessee Valley Authority dams. The connection between geography and mission was direct. The land helped conceal the plants, and the regional power system helped run them. The work planned there was experimental, industrial, and enormous. Oak Ridge would eventually contain three major uranium enrichment facilities: Y-12, using electromagnetic isotope separation, K-25, using gaseous diffusion, and S-50, using liquid thermal diffusion. These were not simply buildings placed behind a fence. They were machines on a regional scale, dependent on steady power, disciplined labor, and the ability to keep thousands of people performing narrow tasks without giving them the full meaning of the process. The choice of Oak Ridge reveals one of Groves's central assumptions. Secrecy was not only a matter of hiding a site from view. It was also a matter of internal separation. The terrain could help divide one operation from another. Workers could be assigned to one plant, one shift, one step in a chain. A person might know how to read a dial, change a setting, inspect a part, or follow a rule, while never being told how that act connected to the weapon being pursued. If Oak Ridge was a landscape of power and separation, Hanford was a landscape of water, distance, and scale. In early 1943, the government acquired land in southeastern Washington along the Columbia River. The site would ultimately be described by the National Park Service as covering roughly 600 square miles, while another National Park Service site selection account describes Groves acquiring 780 square miles along the Columbia River. Either figure suggests the same reality. Hanford was not a factory site in any ordinary sense. It was a vast, controlled zone, large enough to hold reactors, chemical processing facilities, fuel fabrication work, roads, rail lines, tanks, barracks, and a construction camp that would itself become a temporary city. Hanford's mission was plutonium production. To produce plutonium on an industrial scale, the project needed nuclear reactors to irradiate uranium fuel rods and chemical processes to extract plutonium from the irradiated uranium. The river was central to this choice. Reactors needed cooling water. The Columbia River provided it in abundance. Hydroelectric power from Grand Coulee and other dams also made the region attractive. Here again, the site was chosen because its natural and built environment matched the operation. Hanford's size also served another purpose. Plutonium production involved new hazards, new uncertainties, and new industrial arrangements. Reactors were placed in the 100 area along the Columbia River. Chemical processing took place in the 200 area. Uranium fuel fabrication was located in the 300 area. This separation was not accidental. Distance was built into the production system. The geography functioned like a form of engineering, spacing out the dangerous and specialized steps of the work. But the creation of Hanford also exposed the human cost of treating geography as military material. The government displaced residents of White Bluffs, Hanford, Richland, and smaller communities. Area tribes were barred from returning to traditional use lands. The official logic of site selection emphasized sparsely populated territory, access to water, and room for secrecy. On the ground, those requirements meant removal. A place that planners saw as suitable because it could be controlled had already been lived in, farmed, traveled, and used. Los Alamos answered a different need. It was not chosen for giant power consumption or reactor cooling. It was chosen as a place where weapons research could be concentrated, guarded, and isolated. Before the final decision, Major John H. Dudley and J. Robert Oppenheimer evaluated possible sites, including Jemez Springs, New Mexico. Oppenheimer favored the Los Alamos Ranch School Mesa. The War Department approved the purchase of the Los Alamos Ranch School on November 25, 1942, for $440,000 in 1942 dollars. The Mesa gave the project something the other sites could not provide in the same way: a bounded scientific community. Los Alamos, known as the Hill, could be reached through controlled routes from Santa Fe. New arrivals often passed through 109 East Palace Avenue, where Dorothy Scarrett McKibben issued passes and directed them onward. Mail moved through P.O. Box 1663 in Santa Fe, a central address that became so embedded in the hidden identity of the place that the Atomic Heritage Foundation states babies born there had P.O. Box 1663 listed as birthplace on birth certificates. Los Alamos was the place where the separated streams of work were meant to converge. Material produced elsewhere could be studied there. Designs could be tested there. Theoretical physics, explosives engineering, metallurgy, ordnance work, and military oversight could be forced into one remote community. Its isolation was not wilderness romance. It was administrative design. The Mesa helped make a laboratory into a controlled wartime settlement. Across these three sites, groves and the project's planners converted regional features into instruments of war. Valleys and ridges became a way to distribute uranium plants. A river corridor became a way to cool plutonium reactors. A mesa became a guarded research enclave. Hydroelectric dams, rail connections, existing towns, and empty-seeming acreage were weighed not for what they had been, but for what the project required them to become. This is why the secret cities cannot be understood as accidents of wartime growth. They were engineered landscapes of concealment and production. Each was selected because it solved a different part of the same problem, and each depended on the others. Oak Ridge worked on enriched uranium and produced small quantities of plutonium at the X-10 graphite reactor for shipment to Los Alamos Research. Hanford built the industrial plutonium path. Los Alamos gathered the scientific and technical effort to turn fissile material into weapons. The fence, then, was only the visible edge. Behind it was a geography of intention. For the people who would soon arrive, that intention was mostly hidden. They saw mud, temporary housing, guard posts, cafeterias, buses, shifts, and rules. They saw land being cleared and buildings rising at a pace that made explanation seem less important than obedience. But before the workers came in, tens of thousands, before the alphabet houses and hutments, before the plants gained their familiar names, the first act was the selection of place. In East Tennessee, that act began to take firm shape on September 19, 1942, with a reservation first known as the Kingston Demolition Range and later as the Clinton Engineer Works. More than 55,000 acres would be purchased at an approximate cost of $3.5 million in 1942 dollars. Farms, ridges, roads, and valleys west of Knoxville were about to be folded into the largest of the Manhattan Project's secret communities. In East Tennessee, the decision first appeared as a change in the status of land. Before it was Oak Ridge, before the name carried any public meaning, the place was a set of valleys and ridges about 20 miles west of Knoxville. It lay in the long, folded geography between the Appalachian Mountains and the Cumberland Plateau, a landscape of farms, wooded slopes, local roads, and small communities. To military planners, that same terrain offered something else: room to build, hills that could separate one industrial area from another, relative isolation without complete remoteness, and access to the power network of the Tennessee Valley Authority. On September 19, 1942, the East Tennessee site was approved. The choice was not announced as the birthplace of a secret atomic city. It could not be. The work itself depended on silence. At first, the area was known by a name that concealed more than it revealed: the Kingston Demolition Range. Later, it would be called the Clinton Engineer Works. Even that name sounded administrative, technical, and deliberately vague. It suggested construction and military engineering, not uranium enrichment, not a hidden city, and not a central piece of the effort to build an atomic weapon. The government purchase that followed was vast. More than 55,000 acres were acquired in 1942 at an approximate cost of $3.5 million in 1942 dollars. Those numbers matter because they show the scale of the decision before the scale of the city was visible. The Manhattan Project did not simply rent a few buildings or expand an existing factory. In East Tennessee, it took possession of an entire working landscape and prepared to remake it for a purpose that almost no one outside a narrow chain of command could understand. The land itself helped make secrecy possible. The valley and ridge pattern of East Tennessee was not a flat, open plain. It was broken into natural compartments. Long ridge lines ran through the area, dividing one valley from the next. For a project built around compartmentalization, this geography was useful. It allowed separate plants, separate roads, separate workforces, and separate routines to exist within one reservation, while still being partially screened from one another by the shape of the ground. That physical separation would become one of Oak Ridge's defining features. Workers could live in the same military-controlled community and still know very little about what was happening a short distance away. A person might see buses, fences, guards, and construction, but not understand the whole system. A ridge could do some of the work of secrecy. A gate could do the rest. The site also had the advantage of being close to Knoxville without being inside it. About 20 miles was close enough for regional access, labor channels, and transportation connections, but far enough to allow the government to create a controlled zone. The reservation could be fenced. Roads could be watched. Movement could be limited by passes and military authority. In the logic of wartime planning, Oak Ridge was neither wilderness nor city. It was something more useful to the Manhattan Project, a place that could be converted quickly into an engineered landscape. And conversion is the quiet word at the heart of this chapter. The place that became Oak Ridge was not empty. The purchase of more than 55,000 acres meant the transfer of farms, homes, fields, wooded land, and familiar routes into federal control. The research record gives us the broad facts of acquisition, cost, and location, and those facts alone are enough to show the force of the transformation. A local geography with ordinary uses was being placed inside a national emergency. Land that had belonged to civilian life was being reorganized around secrecy, electricity, production, and command. The first name, Kingston Demolition Range, suggests how little the outside world was meant to know. It was a cover of function and misdirection, plain enough to sound plausible, dull enough not to invite close attention. The later name, Clinton Engineer Works, was more durable and became the wartime administrative identity of the site. Clinton was a nearby town, and Engineer Works placed the project within the language of military construction. It was an accurate name, in one sense. The Army Corps of Engineers was central to the Manhattan Project's construction regime. But it was incomplete by design. It did not say what the factories would do. It did not say why so much power would be needed. It did not say why such a large reservation had to be fenced and guarded. Inside that ambiguity, Oak Ridge began to take shape. Its mission would eventually center on uranium enrichment, one of the most demanding industrial problems of the war. Natural uranium contains different isotopes, and the isotope needed for the weapon, uranium-235, had to be separated from the more common uranium-238. That process required enormous facilities, disciplined labor, and immense electrical power. This is why East Tennessee's connection to the Tennessee Valley Authority mattered so deeply. The TVA's nearby hydroelectric dams helped make the site attractive because enrichment work required electricity on a scale few ordinary communities could imagine. But in the beginning, the physical fact came first, the reservation. Before the great plants were understood by their letter and number names, the ground had to be claimed, surveyed, cleared, graded, and connected. Roads had to be improved or built. Rail access had to be made useful. Construction areas had to be organized. Housing areas had to be planned. The reservation had to become both an industrial site and a human settlement, because the machines could not run without workers, and workers could not remain without places to sleep, eat, wash, travel, and raise children. This was the central tension in the making of Oak Ridge. It was planned as a temporary wartime instrument, but it had to function as a city. It was built for secrecy, but secrecy did not reduce the need for schools, cafeterias, medical services, transportation, and housing. It was under military control, but it had to contain civilian routines. The earliest stage of Oak Ridge was therefore not only a story of land acquisition, it was the beginning of a contradiction, a hidden place that would have to become large enough to be ordinary. The scale soon pushed beyond what planners first imagined. Oak Ridge was originally planned for about 13,000 residents. That figure belonged to the logic of an organized construction project, not to what the project would become. As the uranium plants expanded and deadlines hardened, the population grew far beyond the original plan. During the war, Oak Ridge would reach more than 75,000 people, making it the largest of the three main Manhattan Project communities. That later population boom can obscure the strangeness of the first moment. In September of 1942, there was no famous Oak Ridge identity. There was no public story of atomic work. There was a military decision, an acquisition of land, and a name that changed as the project's administrative needs changed. The place moved from ordinary geography into classified geography before it moved into memory. The word Oak Ridge itself would eventually stand for a complete wartime world, the Y-12 electromagnetic separation plant, the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant, the S-50 liquid thermal diffusion plant, the X-10 graphite reactor, the buses and badges, the guard posts and censored mail, the alphabet houses and hutments. But those later details rested on the first act of transformation. The government needed not just a factory site, but a landscape large enough to hide multiple factories, a workforce, and the connections between them. This is why the valley and ridge terrain mattered beyond scenery. The land helped define the operating culture. Separation was built into the layout. Distance became a security tool. Hills and controlled roads helped keep workers' knowledge narrow. One plant could be part of the same reservation and still feel distant from another. The geography supported the project's larger principle. Many people could contribute to one outcome without seeing the whole design. Oak Ridge, before it had a name, was therefore already becoming Oak Ridge in practice. Its future was embedded in the requirements that led planners there: secrecy, space, electricity, military control, and speed. The place had to be close enough to the TVA power system to feed industrial machines, large enough to absorb factories and housing, and isolated enough to place ordinary movement under watch. It had to be transformed without explaining the full reason for the transformation. By the time the Clinton Engineer Works began to fill with construction crews, temporary structures, roads, and work schedules, the first stage of concealment had succeeded. The land had been renamed. Its purpose had been hidden inside administrative language. Its boundaries were becoming military boundaries. And the largest secret community of the Manhattan Project was beginning from a set of East Tennessee valleys where the landscape itself had been recruited into the war. What followed was not a slow town-building process. It was an acceleration. A place planned for thousands would be forced to hold tens of thousands. The reservation would need houses, dormitories, cafeterias, schools, buses, utilities, and rules almost as quickly as it needed industrial plants. The secret would not remain small. It would have to be housed. The secret had to be housed before it could be explained. At Oak Ridge, that meant building a city under conditions that would have strained an ordinary municipality in peacetime, and doing it while the place itself remained under military control. The reservation had begun as land. Ridges, valleys, farms, roads, and scattered communities folded into the Clinton Engineer Works. But land alone could not enrich uranium, pour concrete, operate machines, staff cafeterias, teach children, or move thousands of people from beds to work gates before dawn. The Manhattan Project needed a population. And once that population began arriving, the scale of the problem changed almost immediately. Oak Ridge had originally been planned for about 13,000 residents. That number belonged to the first imagined version of the town, large but still manageable, secret but not yet overwhelming. It suggested a controlled wartime community, designed around a defined labor force and a limited set of services. But the work at Oak Ridge did not stay within that first estimate. Construction expanded. Industrial plants rose across the reservation. Crews arrived to build them, and then other workers arrived to operate them. Families followed. Support workers came with the needs of a population that was no longer just a construction force, but a living city. By the height of the war, Oak Ridge had grown to more than 75,000 people. That increase was not simply a statistic. It was a daily pressure felt in lumber, asphalt, food service, bus routes, schoolrooms, utility lines, and waiting lists. A place imagined for thousands had to absorb tens of thousands, and it had to do so quickly enough that the larger mission would not slow down. The atomic fence did not reduce ordinary needs. It concentrated them. Inside the controlled boundaries, Oak Ridge became one of the strangest civic projects of the Second World War, a secret city that had to function like a normal one. People needed houses, but also cafeterias. They needed roads, but also schools, infrastructure. They needed workplaces, but also routines that could make wartime dislocation feel survivable. There were passes, guards, restricted areas, and censored addresses, but there were also grocery lines, school schedules, meals, muddy streets, and the constant search for a place to sleep. The contradiction was built into the town from the beginning. Oak Ridge was supposed to be temporary, yet it required the systems of permanence. It was supposed to be hidden, yet it kept growing. It was supposed to serve industrial production, yet it became a social world, with neighborhoods, children, buses, cafeterias, and the small frictions of everyday life. The speed of construction shaped the look of the town. Oak Ridge did not have the slow irregularity of a city that had grown over generations. It had the planned urgency of war. Its houses were not architectural gestures in the usual sense. They were answers to a logistics problem. How could thousands of workers and families be sheltered quickly, with materials available in wartime, on land that had only recently been turned into a military reservation? One answer became known through the alphabet houses. These were standardized house types, identified by letters, and they became part of the visual language of Oak Ridge. Some of the best-known designs were associated with Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, the architectural and engineering firm involved in planning housing for the wartime community. The letters helped organize construction and allocation. They turned domestic life into a system that could be ordered, repeated, assigned, and expanded. Among these were the Cemesto houses, including Type A through Type H homes. Cemesto was a cement and asbestos material, a wartime building solution that reflected the demand for speed, standardization, and available materials. The name itself suggested the hybrid nature of the place, part home, part industrial product. These were houses built not just for comfort, but for rapid deployment in a city whose population was outpacing its original plan. Other Oak Ridge houses became known as flat-top designs, including types A, B, C, S, and V. Their simple profiles and standardized plans matched the wartime logic of the reservation. They were not meant to create a picturesque town. They were meant to house people close enough to the work, in sufficient numbers, under conditions that could be managed by the authorities responsible for the project. The alphabet houses mattered because they showed how secrecy and urban planning overlapped. A worker could live in a Type B or a Type C house, ride a bus on the reservation, pass through security, and spend the day performing a task whose full meaning remained hidden. The house looked ordinary enough. The routine looked ordinary enough. But the entire town existed because of a military-industrial purpose that most residents could not fully know. Oak Ridge had to be legible to administrators, even when it was not legible to the people who lived there. Housing types, work assignments, security rules, and transportation patterns all helped make the growing city governable. The population boom required more than construction. It required classification. That classification extended into daily movement. Roads were not just roads. They were part of a controlled landscape connecting housing areas, service areas, and enormous industrial plants. Cafeterias were not just places to eat. They were part of the machinery that kept shifts moving. Schools were not just civic amenities, they were evidence that the supposedly temporary town had become a family community. Every ordinary service carried the mark of urgency. A city of more than 75,000 people could not survive on secrecy alone. It needed food at scale. It needed systems for children whose parents had been drawn into a project they could not discuss freely. It needed maintenance crews, clerks, drivers, teachers, cooks, guards, engineers, and construction workers. It needed the whole hidden economy of support that makes a city operate. And because Oak Ridge was behind the fence, much of that life unfolded within a closed world. For many residents, the physical environment reinforced both belonging and uncertainty. They lived in named house types and assigned quarters. They moved through a city that had appeared with astonishing speed. They saw construction everywhere: buses and work crews, unfinished roads, new buildings, and the constant expansion of a place that still did not fully explain itself. The sense of purpose was strong, but the purpose remained divided into compartments. The town's growth also revealed a deeper tension in the Manhattan Project. Officials needed workers to feel stable enough to stay, but not informed enough to compromise the secret. They needed a civic world without civic openness. Oak Ridge required schools and homes, but it was still governed as a military reservation. It required community, but also surveillance. It offered the rhythms of domestic life while restricting speech, movement, and knowledge. That tension made Oak Ridge different from an ordinary boomtown. Many American towns had grown quickly around mines, mills, shipyards, or military bases. But Oak Ridge was growing around a mystery. Its residents could see the consequences of the work all around them: the traffic, the housing shortage, the cafeterias, the plants, the fences, the lights, the demand for electricity, the presence of guards. What they could not see was the full design connecting these pieces. The alphabet houses stand out because they make the hidden city visible in human scale. The vast industrial plants would define Oak Ridge in strategic terms, but the houses show how the project entered daily life. A family did not live in an isotope separation process. It lived in a small, standardized house on a new street, in a town where neighbors might know one another's routines, but not one another's work. Children went to school in a place whose name and purpose were still guarded. Meals were eaten, laundry was done, and shifts began, all inside a landscape created for an unprecedented weapon. The word temporary could not contain what Oak Ridge became. Temporary buildings can still shape permanent memories. Temporary roads can become the roots of childhood. Temporary houses can become neighborhoods. Temporary secrecy can organize marriages, friendships, work habits, and fears. By the time the wartime population passed 75,000, Oak Ridge was no longer merely a construction site attached to a set of plants. It was a complete civic world, built at the speed of war and held inside an atomic fence. And yet the reason for all of this growth lay beyond the houses and cafeterias. The city had expanded because the machines required people: operators, maintenance workers, engineers, guards, clerks, and crews, disciplined into narrow tasks. Across the reservation, Y12, K25, and S50 were taking shape as three different answers to the same problem: how to separate the rare uranium isotope needed for a bomb. The city made the labor possible. The labor fed the plants. And inside those plants, thousands of workers would learn only the small part of the machine they were allowed to know. The city had been built to hold a secret, but the secret itself was not one thing. At Oak Ridge, it was divided among plants, fences, gates, shifts, badges, and jobs. A worker might know a dial, a valve, a panel, a pipe, or a schedule, and still not know the larger purpose. That was not an accident of confusion. It was part of the design. Across the Clinton Engineer Works, three major uranium enrichment facilities stood as separate industrial answers to the same scientific problem. They were Y12, K25, and S50. Each was trying, in its own way, to separate uranium-235 from uranium-223-8. The difference mattered because natural uranium contains only a small amount of uranium-235, the isotope the bomb program needed. Most of the material was uranium-238, chemically similar, physically almost the same, and difficult to separate by ordinary means. That phrase, almost the same, is where Oak Ridge became enormous. If uranium-235 and uranium-238 had behaved like oil and water, the problem might have belonged to a small plant. But the isotopes were versions of the same element. Chemically, they were nearly indistinguishable. The difference was in mass. Uranium-235 was slightly lighter. Uranium-238 was slightly heavier. The entire industrial landscape of Oak Ridge grew from the attempt to exploit that tiny difference at wartime speed. Y-12 used electromagnetic isotope separation. In plain terms, it used magnetism to sort charged particles by weight. If uranium atoms were turned into charged particles and sent through a magnetic field, the lighter uranium-235 particles would bend along a slightly different path from the heavier uranium-238 particles. That separation was extremely delicate. It required powerful magnets, carefully controlled machines, and operators who could keep the equipment within narrow working limits. The machines at Y-12 were called Calutrons, a name drawn from California University's cyclotron technology. To many of the people working there, though, the name did not explain much. It was a word attached to a machine, and the machine was attached to a job. Watch the meter. Adjust the controls. Keep the beam steady. Record the readings. Do not ask unnecessary questions. This was the essence of compartmentalization at Oak Ridge. A person could be trained to perform a task with care and precision without being told the destination of the material, the scale of the weapon program, or even the meaning of the uranium isotope being separated. The system depended on skill, but not on full disclosure. It asked for discipline more than understanding. Elsewhere on the reservation, K-25 pursued the same goal through a very different method: gaseous diffusion. Here, the problem was not to bend charged particles in a magnetic field, but to push uranium in gaseous form through barriers. Because the molecules containing uranium-235 were slightly lighter than those containing uranium-238, they would pass through a porous barrier at a slightly different rate. One pass did not solve the problem. The difference was too small. The process had to be repeated again and again, through many stages, gradually increasing the concentration of uranium-235. Gaseous diffusion was an industrial method built on patience, scale, and repetition. It required a vast plant, elaborate systems of piping, barriers, pumps, and controls, and an extraordinary supply of electricity. K-25 was not simply a building where a process happened. It was a machine made of buildings, systems, workers, maintenance crews, and power lines. According to the National Park Service site selection account, K-25 employed about 12,000 workers at its peak. That figure gives a sense of the human scale behind a method that can sound, at first, like a laboratory phrase. The work was repetitive because the physics demanded repetition. Every stage made only a small improvement. Every small improvement had to be protected by careful operation. The plant needed people who arrived on time, followed rules, watched equipment, repaired failures, and kept the process moving. If Y-12 suggested a world of magnets and beams, K-25 suggested something broader and heavier, a landscape of industrial endurance. Then there was S-50, the liquid thermal diffusion plant. Its method again used the slight difference between uranium isotopes, but through heat and movement in a liquid system. In accessible terms, thermal diffusion relied on temperature differences to help separate lighter and heavier isotopic material. When a mixture was exposed to carefully controlled hot and cool conditions, the components behaved in slightly different ways. As with the other methods, the effect was not dramatic in a single step. It had to be engineered into a process large enough to matter. S-50 was another reminder that Oak Ridge did not bet on one solution alone. The Manhattan Project operated under pressure, and uranium enrichment was too urgent to be entrusted to a single uncertain method. Y-12, K-25, and S-50 were not duplicates. They were parallel approaches, each expensive, each difficult, each demanding its own workforce and infrastructure. Together, they made Oak Ridge a place where scientific theory became industrial routine. That routine drew power from the geography chosen earlier. Oak Ridge had been placed in East Tennessee in part because of access to electrical power from the Tennessee Valley Authority's nearby hydroelectric dams. The need was not incidental. Uranium enrichment consumed immense amounts of electricity. The machines did not run on secrecy alone. They ran on power, metal, construction, trained hands, and round-the-clock discipline. In that sense, the atomic fence enclosed more than classified information. It enclosed an electrical appetite. It enclosed machines whose purpose most workers could not fully describe, and whose success depended on thousands of people doing limited jobs well. Behind the gates, a wartime city woke, ate, rode buses, changed shifts, and returned to dormitories and alphabet houses. Inside the plants, the work continued in fragments. One worker might be responsible for observing an instrument. Another might maintain a piece of equipment. Another might move materials through a controlled route. Another might type, file, guard, clean, repair, or supervise. The purpose was divided until it became almost invisible. The larger system knew what the individual did not. That was how Oak Ridge could employ tens of thousands of people in a mission that remained hidden even from many of them. The secrecy also changed the meaning of expertise. Some scientists and engineers understood far more than the operators on the floor. But the project still depended on workers who did not need to understand nuclear physics to perform essential duties. A machine that separates isotopes is not only a scientific instrument. At wartime scale, it becomes a labor system. It requires obedience to procedure. It rewards steadiness. It punishes small errors. And when it is secret, it asks people to trust that the task in front of them is important, without being allowed to know why. This was one of the quiet contradictions of Oak Ridge. The work was intensely technical, but much of it was organized so that non-technical workers could carry it out. The plants were among the most ambitious industrial facilities of the war, but many workers experienced them as narrow routines. They were helping solve one of the most difficult separation problems in modern science, while being told only enough to keep the process moving. Y12, K25, and S50 therefore reveal the deeper structure of the secret city. The houses, cafeterias, schools, roads, and buses existed because the plants required a stable population. The plants existed because the bomb program required enriched uranium, and the enriched uranium required methods that magnified a tiny physical difference into an industrial campaign. At Y12, magnetism separated paths. At K25, gas moved through barriers. At S50, heat and diffusion helped sort material through a liquid process. 3 methods, 1 problem. 3 plants, 1 reservation. 3 ways of turning the slight difference between uranium-23.5 and uranium-23.8 into production. For the workers, the machines often remained partly unexplained. That partial knowledge was not a flaw in the system. It was one of its protections. The Manhattan Project needed labor, but it also feared exposure. So it built a city where people could live ordinary lives under extraordinary limits, and it built plants where people could do extraordinary work in ordinary motions. Among the most vivid of those motions took place at Y12, where young women sat before panels and watched the behavior of machines whose full purpose was withheld from them. They became known as the Calutron girls. Their work belonged to the same hidden system of magnets, electricity, uranium, and discipline. But their story also leads deeper into one of Oak Ridge's strangest material facts. The machines they operated depended not only on secrecy and labor, but on a vast reserve of silver borrowed from the United States government itself. At Y12, the hidden work of Oak Ridge narrowed into a particular human posture, a young woman seated before a control panel, watching needles, meters, and lights, making small adjustments when the machine drifted from its assigned path. The motion looked routine. It could be taught, timed, supervised, and repeated across shifts. But behind that routine was one of the most demanding technical problems of the war, separating uranium-23.5 from uranium-23.8. The difference between those 2 isotopes was almost impossibly small in ordinary human terms. They were forms of the same element, but one was useful for the weapon the Manhattan Project was trying to build, and the other was far more common. Oak Ridge existed in large part because nature had not made that separation easy. The rare isotope had to be coaxed out by machines, and the machines had to be built at a scale that belonged less to the laboratory than to wartime industry. Y12's answer was electromagnetic isotope separation. The central machine was called the Calutron, a name drawn from California University cyclotron technology. That naming carried a trace of the scientific lineage behind the plant. The Calutron did not appear from nowhere. It came out of physics, magnetism, charged particles, and the pre-war experimental world of cyclotrons. But at Oak Ridge, the idea was multiplied into an industrial system. What had been a principle of laboratory equipment became a fenced wartime factory. The Calutrons at Y-12 were arranged in racetracks. The word sounds almost casual, but it described a powerful geometry of production, long, curved arrangements of machines through which the process could be repeated over and over. In these racetracks, uranium material was fed into a system where electromagnetic forces helped separate the lighter uranium-23-5 from the heavier uranium-23-8. The point was not drama. It was control. It was the careful management of fields, currents, targets, and timing, repeated until enough of the rare isotope could be collected. Y-12 used 1,152 calutrons. That number gives some sense of the scale, but only if we pause over it. One machine would have been complex. A few machines would have required specialized attention. More than 1,000 machines demanded a new kind of labor force, a discipline of observation and adjustment spread across many operators, many panels, and many shifts. The plant needed people who could follow instructions precisely without needing to know the full meaning of what they were doing. Approximately 10,000 young women became known as the Calutron girls. Many had come to Oak Ridge as part of the broader wartime migration into the secret city. They entered a world where the reservation's purpose was hidden, where addresses were controlled, where badges and fences shaped movement, and where information was given in fragments. At Y-12, that fragmentation reached the level of the hand and the eye. The operators could be taught how to keep a machine running well. They could be judged by performance. They could be praised for maintaining the right readings. But generally, they were not told the ultimate purpose of their work. This was not simply a matter of leaving out an explanation. It was an operating principle of the Manhattan Project. Knowledge was divided so that no single worker, or at least very few workers, could see the whole design. A person might understand the behavior of a meter without knowing the destination of the material. Another might handle maintenance without knowing the weapon connection. Another might record production data without knowing how it fit into the final assembly of a bomb. At Y-12, thousands of operators became part of a process whose consequences were kept beyond the room. The Calutron girls were not incidental to the plant. Their work mattered. The National Park Service account notes that their labor produced about 140 pounds of uranium-23-5 through 1944 and 1945, enough for one atomic bomb. That figure draws a line between the small gestures at the control panel and the larger arc of the war. The operators were not merely tending machines in a remote industrial valley. They were helping produce the material that made an atomic weapon possible, even if that connection was withheld from them at the time. The story is powerful partly because it resists a simple image of wartime science. The Manhattan Project is often remembered through famous physicists, military commanders, and remote laboratories. But at Y-12, the work depended on young women operating machines with patience and discipline. Their expertise was practical, immediate, and closely supervised. They learned how the machine behaved. They learned what the needles meant in the limited sense required by the job. They learned when to adjust, when to wait, and how to keep the process steady. The secrecy around them created a strange kind of competence. They could be good at the work without being allowed to understand it. In an ordinary factory, a worker might know the product being made, even if they did not know every technical detail. At Y-12, the product itself was obscured. The operators were told enough to perform, not enough to interpret. That gap was one of the central conditions of life behind the atomic fence. People were trusted with tasks, but not with meaning. And then there was the silver. The calutrons required powerful magnet components. Under normal conditions, copper would have been the obvious material for electrical conductors. But wartime copper was in critical demand for other military uses. The Manhattan Project turned instead to a reserve that seems, at first, almost unbelievable: silver from United States government vaults at West Point. Approximately 13,540 short tons of silver were borrowed for Calutron magnet components. In another measure, that was about 395 million troy ounces. The detail has the quality of a ledger entry and a myth at the same time. The secret wartime project, building hidden machines in East Tennessee, drew on a national store of precious metal held under government control. The silver was not borrowed for decoration or currency. It was transformed into part of an industrial apparatus for separating isotopes. This is one of those facts that reveals the Manhattan Project's reach. The project could take farmland in East Tennessee and turn it into the Clinton Engineer Works. It could draw tens of thousands of people into a city that had barely existed before the war. It could consume extraordinary amounts of electrical power from the wider regional system. And it could borrow silver from government vaults, not as wealth to be spent, but as material to be shaped into magnets for machines most workers were not allowed to understand. The silver also shows how secrecy depended on ordinary institutions. The project was hidden, but it was not separate from the nation. It ran through federal authority, military command, industrial contractors, public power, government land acquisition, and treasury reserves. Behind the fence at Oak Ridge stood a chain of decisions that reached far beyond the ridges of East Tennessee. West Point's vaults, Y-12's racetracks, and the control panels watched by the Calutron girls were all part of the same concealed system. For the women at the panels, however, the workday was not experienced as a national abstraction. It was a shift. It was a badge. It was a supervisor. It was a set of readings that had to be kept within bounds. It was the discipline of not asking too many questions in a place where questions could mark the edge of permission. The machines were enormous, but the assigned field of attention could be very small. That narrowness was deliberate. It protected the project, but it also shaped memory. Many workers learned only after the bombing of Hiroshima what their labor had helped make possible. The revelation did not merely add information. It changed the meaning of remembered actions. A dial watched for months became part of a weapon. A machine room became part of a global turning point. A job that had been described as important war work acquired a terrible specificity. The Calutron girls stand, then, at the intersection of skill and secrecy. They were essential and uninformed, trusted and restricted, visible in the plant but kept away from the larger purpose. The silver in the magnets adds another layer to that contradiction. Precious metal from national vaults was placed inside hidden machines, while the human beings operating those machines were often denied the full knowledge of what they served. Y-12 was not only a technical achievement, it was a social arrangement. Its racetracks depended on physics, but also on hierarchy. Its output depended on electricity, magnets, uranium, and the disciplined labor of thousands. The plant showed how the Manhattan Project could mobilize materials and people with extraordinary speed while controlling what those people were allowed to know. That control did not fall evenly across Oak Ridge. The secret city sorted people not only by job and clearance, but also by race, housing, and access to basic comfort. While some workers lived in alphabet houses and dormitories built for the expanding wartime population, others were pushed into far harsher conditions. The same fenced city that turned silver into magnet coils and young operators into instruments of isotope separation also reproduced older American boundaries inside its gates. Behind the atomic fence, secrecy was not the only line that divided daily life. The lines inside Oak Ridge were not only drawn around factories, passes, and restricted gates. They were drawn through the living city itself. The same place that could borrow silver from United States government vaults at West Point, reshape a Tennessee valley, and build industrial plants at a pace few Americans had ever seen, also carried older American divisions into its new streets. Behind the atomic fence, the future was being assembled. But daily life still depended on rules that decided who could live in comfort, who could bring a family into a proper house, and who would be assigned to the margins of the secret city. Oak Ridge had been presented as an emergency landscape, a wartime settlement built for speed. Its housing problem was real. The city had been planned for about 13,000 residents and then swelled to more than 75,000. Every road, cafeteria, school, dormitory, and house had to answer to that pressure. The alphabet houses, including Semesto and flat-top designs associated with Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, became part of the city's visual order. They were practical wartime dwellings, quickly built and categorized by type. They belonged to the language of efficiency, but efficiency was not neutral. At Oak Ridge, African American workers were excluded from the alphabet housing system. They were not simply placed lower on a waiting list for the same homes. They were assigned to hutments. In a city where housing was already a measure of rank, access, and stability, that exclusion mattered. It meant that the secret city did not only compartmentalize information. It compartmentalized domestic life. The National Park Service describes the African American hutments at Oak Ridge as 16 by 16-foot plywood structures. They had shutters, screenless windows, and a central oil stove. These details are small enough to sound ordinary until they are placed beside the scale of the project around them. This was a city supplied for uranium enrichment, a city served by the immense electrical demands of Y-12, K-25, and S-50. It existed because the federal government could mobilize land, labor, material, engineering, and power at astonishing speed. Yet family hutments in the African American area had no electricity or running water. That contradiction is one of the clearest ways to see Oak Ridge whole. The story of the Manhattan Project is often told through secrecy and scientific urgency, electromagnetic separation, gaseous diffusion, liquid thermal diffusion, calutrons, reactors, plutonium, and the race to finish before the war's end. All of that was real. The machinery mattered. The schedules mattered. The guarded plants mattered. But those machines were surrounded by people, and those people lived according to unequal rules. For white workers and their families who entered the alphabet housing system, the city could offer a version of wartime normalcy. The houses were temporary in purpose, but they created neighborhoods. They gave the secret city a domestic face. A worker might leave a classified plant after a shift, pass through guarded routines, and return to a home that gave shape to private life. Even in a city under military control, even under censorship and surveillance, a house could make the extraordinary feel manageable. For African American workers, the hutment system told a different story. The plywood walls, shutters, screenless windows, oil stove, and lack of running water were not incidental hardships of the early construction period. They were part of a racial housing order. The exclusion from alphabet housing marked African American workers as necessary to the project, but not entitled to the same basic comforts offered elsewhere in the city. Their labor helped sustain Oak Ridge, but the city did not return that labor with equal shelter. The conditions imposed on African American women were especially stark. According to the National Park Service account, the African American women's hutment area was surrounded by a rough scrap lumber fence, had a 10 o'clock p.m. curfew, and was called the women's pen. The phrase is blunt, and it carries the weight of how those boundaries were experienced and described. Oak Ridge was already a fenced city, guarded from the outside world. Here, within that larger enclosure, another enclosure appeared. A secret city inside a secret city, a fence within the fence. This matters because the Manhattan Project often used necessity as its operating language. Sites were chosen because they were remote, spacious, powerful, and defensible. Workers were told only what they needed to know because secrecy was considered essential. Housing was built quickly because the population grew faster than normal city planning could manage. But segregation at Oak Ridge was not just an unavoidable side effect of speed. It reflected a national system of racial separation reproduced inside a new federal wartime community. The result was a city of shared purpose without shared conditions. African American workers were part of the same mobilization. They lived behind the same controlled perimeter. They were subject to the same wartime secrecy and the same pressure of production. Their presence belonged to the same national emergency that brought engineers, clerks, operators, construction crews, guards, cooks, and plant workers into East Tennessee. Yet the privileges of the city were divided. To understand Oak Ridge only as an engineering achievement is to miss the social machinery that operated beside the industrial machinery. The city sorted uranium isotopes in one set of buildings and sorted people in another set of rules. The separation was visible in where people slept, where families could live, and which homes received the comforts of electricity and water. The alphabet houses and the hutments were not just different structures. They were evidence of different claims on citizenship, safety, and dignity within the same federal project. The contrast becomes sharper when placed beside the wider scale of Manhattan Project resources. At Oak Ridge, vast quantities of electricity fed machines that few workers fully understood. The Tennessee Valley Authority's nearby hydroelectric power helped make the site attractive in the first place. The project could coordinate construction across tens of thousands of acres. It could assemble plants whose internal processes were among the most complex industrial efforts of the war. It could control addresses, movement, and speech. But in the African American family hutment area, The basic infrastructure of domestic life was withheld. There is no need to exaggerate the point. The documented facts are severe enough. African American workers were excluded from alphabet housing. They were assigned to hutments. Family hutments in the African American area had no electricity or running water. The women's hutment area was fenced with scrap lumber, placed under a 10 o'clock p.m. curfew, and remembered in the National Park Service account by the name Women's Pen. These details do not sit outside the Manhattan Project story. They are part of it. They also complicate the image of the secret city as a single community united by purpose. Oak Ridge did have shared features: secrecy, guarded entry, rapid growth, wartime discipline, and a sense that important work was underway. But those shared features did not erase hierarchy. A worker could be inside the same fence and still live in a very different Oak Ridge. One person's hidden city might include a government-built house, a neighborhood, and the conveniences of a planned wartime town. Another person's hidden city might mean a plywood hutment without running water, with curfew and separation imposed on top of secrecy. In that sense, Oak Ridge reveals a deeper truth about national mobilization. The Manhattan Project was extraordinary, but it was not separate from the country that built it. It drew on American universities, American industry, American military authority, American public power, and American labor. It also drew into itself American segregation. The fence did not keep that out. It carried it inward and gave it new forms under federal management. The secret cities were built to solve problems of war. They were designed to produce materials that had never before been produced on that scale, for weapons that most workers could not yet imagine. But the lives lived inside them were not abstract. They were measured in beds, stoves, windows, fences, curfews, water lines, and electrical wires. These were the daily facts by which people understood their place in the city. Oak Ridge could be both a center of scientific urgency and a place of ordinary injustice. That is not a contradiction to be smoothed away. It is the contradiction that helps define it. The same wartime government that moved mountains of material and commanded unprecedented secrecy also allowed racial inequality to shape who received the basic comforts of the new atomic town. And still, the work continued. Across the reservation, the plants ran, the shifts changed, the guarded roads carried workers toward assignments they only partly understood. Uranium enrichment was one path through Oak Ridge, but it was not the only one. Beyond the housing areas and beyond the separation plants, another facility was beginning to connect this Tennessee city to a different atomic trail. At X-10, the graphite reactor would produce small but crucial amounts of plutonium, material that would travel onward to Los Alamos and tie Oak Ridge even more tightly to the hidden network of the bomb. The last chapter left Oak Ridge divided by more than fences and badges. It was a city where the work of atomic production moved forward beside an unequal social order, where comfort, privacy, and even running water depended on race and assignment. Yet, beyond the housing areas, beyond the roads that carried workers between guarded gates, another kind of boundary was being crossed. Oak Ridge was not only separating uranium, it was beginning to open a path toward plutonium. That path ran through X-10. The X-10 graphite reactor stood inside the Clinton Engineer Works as one more restricted place in a landscape already full of them. To many people in Oak Ridge, the name would have been just another letter and number designation in a city built from codes: Y12, K25, S50, X10. The language itself helped conceal the work. It reduced enormous industrial purposes to labels that could be spoken without explaining anything. A worker might know where to report, what instrument to watch, what valve to check, what badge to show, and still not know how the whole system fit together. But X-10 mattered because it connected Oak Ridge to a second atomic route. At Y12, K25, and S50, the central problem was uranium enrichment. These plants were different in method but related in purpose. Y12 used electromagnetic isotope separation. K25 used gaseous diffusion. S50 used liquid thermal diffusion. All three belong to the effort to separate uranium-235 from uranium-238, a task that demanded immense electrical power, huge buildings, trained routines, and workers kept inside narrow compartments of knowledge. X-10 belonged to a different part of the same secret war. Its graphite reactor produced plutonium. From 1943 to 1945, X-10 produced approximately 326 grams of plutonium. In ordinary terms, that amount seems almost impossibly small. It was not a trainload, not a warehouse stack, not the visible output one might expect from a wartime industrial site that had consumed land, money, electricity, housing, roads, and labor on the scale of Oak Ridge. 326 grams is a quantity that could be held in the hand, though not safely and certainly not casually. Yet the smallness is exactly what makes it revealing. The Manhattan Project was not always about the mass production of familiar goods. It was about controlling rare materials, unusual processes, and hidden chains of work in which a few grams could carry enormous scientific importance. The plutonium from X-10 did not remain in Tennessee. It was shipped to Los Alamos for research. That movement of material is one of the clearest ways to see the Manhattan Project as a connected system rather than a set of isolated secret places. Oak Ridge was not only a guarded city in East Tennessee. Los Alamos was not only a remote mesa in New Mexico. Hanford was not only a future industrial reservation along the Columbia River. Each place was built for a separate mission, but none of those missions stood alone. The secret cities depended on one another, even when the people inside them were prevented from understanding the dependency. For workers at Oak Ridge, the daily experience might have seemed local and repetitive. A shift began. A pass was checked. A bus or road carried them to a plant. A supervisor assigned a task. The task might involve meters, machinery, maintenance, security, food service, clerical work, construction, or cleaning. The work could feel detached from the larger war, not because it was unimportant, but because the larger meaning had been deliberately withheld. Compartmentalization was not an accident of confusion. It was a structure of control. X-10 shows how effective that structure could be. The reactor's product traveled outward, but knowledge did not travel freely with it. Plutonium could move from Oak Ridge to Los Alamos. Information about why it mattered, how it would be studied, and how it might fit into a weapon remained restricted. The material crossed the country more easily than the full explanation crossed a workplace. At Los Alamos, the work was weapons research. The mesa, known to many simply as the Hill, was the place where scientists, engineers, military authorities, technicians, and support workers tried to turn atomic materials into usable bomb designs. New arrivals often passed first through 109 East Palace Avenue in Santa Fe, where Dorothy Scarrett McKibben issued passes and directed people onward. Mail moved through P.O. Box 1663 in Santa Fe, a single address that concealed the community above. Los Alamos had its own secrecy, its own guarded routines, and its own ways of turning a real place into something administratively hidden. The plutonium from X-10 entered that world as research material. It helped connect an industrial reactor in Tennessee to the weapons laboratory in New Mexico. That connection mattered because plutonium was not merely another version of enriched uranium. It represented another route to an atomic weapon, one that would require its own research, handling, and design work. Oak Ridge's small output from X-10 helped Los Alamos study that route before larger-scale production elsewhere could fully supply it. This is why X-10 belongs in the story of Oak Ridge, even though Oak Ridge is often remembered first for uranium enrichment. The secret city was not a single machine. It was a collection of specialized plants, each contributing to a larger system. Y12, K25, and S50 formed one part of that system. X-10 formed another. Together, they made Oak Ridge both a uranium city and an early plutonium city, a place where different atomic paths briefly ran side by side behind the same guarded reservation. The reactor also reveals a deeper logic of the Manhattan Project. General Leslie R. Groves and the project's planners did not simply choose remote or controllable sites and then fill them with factories. They matched geography to purpose. Oak Ridge had space, secrecy, and access to the electrical power needed for uranium enrichment. Los Alamos had isolation for weapons research. Hanford, soon to enter the story more fully, would offer a vast area, Columbia River cooling water, and hydroelectric power from Grand Coulee and other dams for industrial-scale plutonium production. The work was divided across the country because the problem itself had been divided into parts. But division created dependence. A worker at one site might never see the others. Someone in Oak Ridge might never set foot at Los Alamos. Someone at Los Alamos might handle material whose production depended on workers in Tennessee they would never meet. Later, workers at Hanford would participate in a process whose product would also move into the weapons program. In this way, secrecy did not prevent connection. It concealed connection from many of the people who made it possible. The phrase "behind the atomic fence" can suggest a single enclosed world, but X-10 reminds us that the fence was also a network. It surrounded places separated by mountains, rivers, deserts, and state lines. It enclosed factory floors in Tennessee, a mesa in New Mexico, and soon a massive industrial reservation in Washington. The fence was physical, with passes and guards and restricted roads. It was also informational, built from silence, partial instructions, censored addresses, and official need-to-know rules. From 1943 to 1945, approximately 326 grams of plutonium moved from X-10 toward research at Los Alamos. That small quantity carried with it the shape of the whole project: hidden production, controlled movement, scientific urgency, and the separation of workers from the full meaning of their labor. It showed that Oak Ridge's role was broader than uranium alone, and that Los Alamos depended on materials born far from the New Mexico mesa. Yet X-10 was only the beginning of the plutonium trail. To produce plutonium on the scale the project required, the government turned west to land along the Columbia River. There, in early 1943, the same logic of secrecy, space, water, and wartime urgency would transform existing communities and bar area tribes from returning to traditional use lands. The trail that passed through X-10 would widen at Hanford, where removal and industrial ambition became part of the same guarded landscape. The plutonium trail that began in the controlled spaces of X-10 did not remain in Tennessee. It moved west in planning documents, military orders, engineering estimates, and maps. By early 1943, the Manhattan Project was looking for something Oak Ridge could not provide on the required scale: a vast production landscape where reactors could run, irradiated uranium could be chemically processed, and the risks of a new industrial process could be kept at a distance from large populations. The place chosen lay along the Columbia River in Washington. To the project's planners, it offered a powerful combination. There was water for cooling. There was hydroelectric power from Grand Coulee and other dams. There was distance from major cities. There was enough open land to separate dangerous operations from one another and to surround the whole enterprise with military control. But the land was not empty. Before it became Hanford in the language of atomic production, this stretch of south-central Washington included existing towns, farms, orchards, ferry routes, homes, and community ties. White Bluffs, Hanford, Richland, and smaller communities stood in the area the government moved to acquire. Families had built lives there before the war made the river a strategic resource. The Columbia was not just a line on an engineering map. It was part of a lived landscape. In early 1943, the federal government acquired the land for the Hanford Engineer Works. Residents were displaced. The towns of White Bluffs and Hanford, along with Richland and smaller settlements, were absorbed into the perimeter of a wartime project whose full purpose could not be publicly explained. In the logic of the Manhattan Project, the removal was urgent, administrative, and necessary. In the lives of those removed, it meant the sudden end of ordinary continuity: homes left behind, farms interrupted, communities broken open by a federal decision tied to a secret weapon. That pattern of removal extended beyond the non-native towns. Area tribes were barred from returning to traditional use lands inside the new reservation. This was another boundary created by the project, less visible in the usual story of reactors and construction schedules, but essential to understanding what the site became. The same fence that protected secrecy also cut people off from places of long-standing use and meaning. Hanford was not only built on land selected for water, power, and space. It was built through exclusion. The size of the place helps explain why. The National Park Service describes the Hanford site as covering roughly 600 square miles. Another National Park Service site selection account describes General Leslie R. Groves acquiring 780 square miles along the Columbia River. The difference in those figures reflects the way wartime land acquisition, operating boundaries, and later historical descriptions can frame the same place in different terms. But either number points to an extraordinary fact. Hanford was not a single factory, not a town, not even a compact industrial district. It was a controlled region. That controlled region was chosen for a mission that had only been tested in miniature at Oak Ridge. X-10 had shown that plutonium could be produced in a reactor and separated for research. Hanford was designed to do that work at industrial scale. Uranium fuel would be fabricated, sent into reactors, irradiated, and then processed chemically to extract plutonium from the irradiated uranium. Every step required distance, coordination, and secrecy. Every step also required an enormous labor force and a transformed landscape. The Columbia River was central to the choice. Reactors needed cooling water. In Hanford's design, the river was not a scenic feature at the edge of the reservation. It was part of the machine. The project required a flow large enough to help carry heat away from nuclear reactors operating at a scale no one had previously managed in production. Water, power, and remoteness became a single strategic formula. That formula also shaped the geography inside the reservation. Hanford's wartime production zones were divided by function. The 300 area was used for uranium fuel fabrication. The 100 area, placed along the Columbia River, held the reactors. The 200 area was used for chemical processing. This separation was not incidental. It reflected the project's need to break plutonium production into stages, to control hazards, and to isolate operations from one another across a wide space. In that sense, Hanford turned geography into an industrial safety system and a secrecy system at the same time. Distance was engineered into the work. Roads and rail lines would connect the zones, but the zones remained separated. Workers could be assigned to one part of the process without seeing the whole. Materials could move through the site under control. The landscape itself helped enforce compartmentalization. The selection of Hanford also shows how General Groves and the Manhattan Project leadership thought about wartime America. The secret cities were not hidden simply by being remote. They were hidden by being reorganized. Oak Ridge had taken a Tennessee valley and ridge landscape and turned it into a fenced production city. Los Alamos would take a mesa and turn it into a weapons laboratory. Hanford took a river corridor with farms, towns, and traditional use lands and turned it into a guarded plutonium factory spread across hundreds of square miles. To wartime planners, the Columbia River site solved several problems at once. It offered abundant cooling water. It was close enough to hydroelectric power to support vast industrial demand. It was sparsely populated compared with more urban areas, allowing the government to impose a wide perimeter. And it gave engineers the space to place reactors, chemical separation plants, fuel fabrication facilities, construction camps, waste areas, and transportation routes at calculated distances from one another. But those advantages came from the perspective of the project. From the perspective of the people already there, the same qualities looked different. Sparsely populated did not mean uninhabited. Available did not mean unused. Strategic land was also someone's home, someone's farm, someone's remembered place, someone's route to the river. The language of wartime necessity could make removal sound clean. On the ground, it was not. Richland was transformed rather than simply erased. Before the project, it was a small agricultural village. Under Manhattan Project control, it became a bedroom community for atomic workers and their families. Architect Gustav Alban Persson planned its wartime community, including hundreds of single-family and multifamily alphabet houses. In that planned transformation, Richland became part of the larger atomic system, a place where domestic life could be arranged to support production, secrecy, and military administration. White Bluffs and Hanford followed a different path. Their names remained, but their earlier civic life was overtaken by the reservation. The old Hanford Townsite would soon be covered by a construction camp of extraordinary scale. The name Hanford would become known less as a town than as a site, a project, an industrial landscape, and later, a historical problem. That shift matters because it shows how quickly wartime language could replace older meanings. A place where people had lived became a place where production happened. The secrecy around Hanford did not mean that nothing was visible. Quite the opposite. Roads appeared. Barracks and cafeterias rose. Rail lines extended. Construction crews poured into the area. Buildings multiplied. But the meaning of the work remained restricted. As at Oak Ridge, many employees knew little beyond the belief that they were doing important war work. The physical scale could be enormous, while the purpose remained compartmentalized. That contradiction was one of the defining features of the secret cities. The Manhattan Project needed thousands of people to perform precise, disciplined tasks. It also needed those same people not to know too much. Hanford would make that contradiction even larger. Its mission required reactors unlike any production reactors built before, chemical processing facilities of immense scale, and a labor system capable of turning a newly acquired reservation into a functioning plutonium factory in months. The story of Hanford therefore begins before the first great construction peak. It begins with selection and removal. It begins with a river harnessed for war, with towns displaced, with area tribes barred from returning to traditional use lands, and with a landscape redefined by federal urgency. The site's later achievements cannot be separated from that beginning. The reactors, the separation plants, the roads, the railroad, and the worker camp all depended on the first act of claiming space. By late 1944, that claimed space would hold a temporary city of workers built over the old Hanford Townsite. Nearly 50,000 people would live in the Hanford construction camp at the peak of construction, feeding the rapid rise of reactors, processing plants, roads, rail lines, tanks, and support buildings. The towns had been removed. The river had been drawn into the machinery of war, and the guarded reservation was ready to become one of the largest construction landscapes of the atomic age. By late 1944, the Hanford Reservation was no longer only a cleared landscape of former farms, orchards, roads, and river towns. It had become a construction machine with a city attached to it. The old Hanford Townsite, emptied by federal order the year before, now lay beneath a temporary world built for workers who had arrived from across the country to do urgent jobs under military secrecy. Nearly 50,000 people lived in the Hanford construction camp at the peak of construction. It was not a city in the ordinary civic sense. It was not meant to grow slowly, develop neighborhoods, or preserve memory. It was a camp designed around movement, production, feeding, sleeping, and returning to work. Its purpose was to support the rapid building of an industrial system unlike anything that had existed before: reactors along the Columbia River, chemical separation plants inland, rail lines, roads, underground tanks, support buildings, and a fuel fabrication complex. The scale was difficult to take in, even for people who worked inside it. Over 30 months, Hanford Construction produced 554 buildings. Crews built 386 miles of road and 158 miles of railroad. They installed large underground tanks, raised 3 plutonium extraction plants, and built the world's first 3 production-scale nuclear reactors. These were not isolated structures. They were parts of a connected wartime landscape, spread across the vast reservation and tied together by transport, power, water, labor, and secrecy. The camp itself answered a basic problem. Before plutonium could be produced, the workforce had to be housed and controlled. Hanford was chosen partly because it was remote and sparsely populated, but that same remoteness created a logistical challenge. Workers needed places to sleep, eat, wash, buy necessities, and receive orders. The solution was to build a temporary city on top of a town that had just been removed from the map. In that sense, the Hanford construction camp carried the central contradiction of the Manhattan Project's secret cities. It was temporary, but enormous. It was ordinary in its daily needs, but extraordinary in its purpose. It had banks, barber shops, beauty shops, a Sears store, and a theater. It had services that made it feel, in fragments, like a recognizable American community. Yet those services existed inside a guarded reservation whose true mission was hidden from most of the people who made the place run. The food service alone suggested the magnitude of the operation. The camp had 8 cafeterias, each described as football field-sized. According to Hanford's official history, more than 50 tons of food were served at every meal. 30,000 donuts were eaten daily. These numbers are almost comic until they are placed back into the rhythm of the camp. Shift work, dust, cold mornings, long lines, heavy equipment, crowded barracks, and the constant demand to keep construction moving. A cafeteria at Hanford was not just a place to eat. It was part of the production system. Food was fuel for the workforce. The camp had to process people as efficiently as the industrial areas processed materials. Workers arrived, ate, slept, boarded transport, and returned. Time spent waiting was time lost. The same urgency that shaped the reactors and chemical plants shaped the kitchens, roads, and barracks. The construction schedule left little room for hesitation. The Manhattan Project was operating under the pressure of war, and Hanford's mission required industrial scale from the beginning. Oak Ridge had provided a model of guarded expansion, but Hanford had different demands. Uranium enrichment in Tennessee required immense electrical power and enormous separation plants. Plutonium production in Washington required reactors, cooling water from the Columbia River, chemical processing facilities, and physical distance between dangerous operations. The reservation's size allowed that separation. The construction camp supplied the labor to fill it. The workers did not need to understand the full system in order to build it. In fact, the project depended on limiting what they knew. Hanford employees were often compartmentalized, and the Hanford site official history states that employees knew little to nothing beyond the belief that they were doing important war work. This was a familiar pattern across the secret cities. At Oak Ridge, many workers had operated machines without knowing that they were helping separate uranium. At Hanford, construction workers poured concrete, laid track, erected buildings, moved materials, and installed systems inside a project whose final purpose remained deliberately obscured. That secrecy changed the meaning of labor. A road was not simply a road. It connected restricted zones. A railroad was not simply a railroad. It moved materials through an industrial reservation designed to make plutonium. A building could be known by its function on a work order, while its place in the larger system remained hidden. Workers could feel the importance of the project through its scale, speed, and security, even when they were denied a complete explanation. The camp's location over the old Hanford Townsite made that secrecy more unsettling. The name remained, but the place had been repurposed. The earlier community had been displaced. The land had been taken into federal control. Area tribes had been barred from returning to traditional use lands. Now, the same ground supported a population far larger than the removed town had ever held, but this new population was transient and governed by wartime necessity. It came with badges, schedules, barracks, cafeterias, military rules, and restricted knowledge. The old town had belonged to a visible landscape of farms and river life. The camp belonged to an invisible map of code names, zones, and guarded operations. To live there was to inhabit a place built for a purpose that most residents could not fully name. The result was not silence exactly. A camp of nearly 50,000 workers was loud. Trucks, trains, tools, meal lines, theater crowds, conversations after shifts. But the loudness sat under a controlled quiet. People could talk about the weather, the dust, the food, the speed of the work, the discomforts of camp life. They could not assemble the whole story. Across the reservation, the three major production zones gave that hidden story its shape. The 300 area supported uranium fuel fabrication. The 100 area along the Columbia River held the reactors. The 200 area contained the chemical processing work that would separate plutonium from irradiated uranium. The construction camp did not have to reveal this full structure to every worker. It only had to move enough people and material into place quickly enough to make the structure real. Speed was the defining condition. In 30 months, Hanford was transformed from a claimed landscape into an operating industrial complex. Roads stretched across the reservation. Rail lines tied work areas together. Buildings rose in clusters. Underground tanks were installed for the dangerous chemical world being created inland from the river. The production reactors took shape near the Columbia, where cooling water could be drawn into the system. The chemical processing plants rose at a distance, massive and separated, built to handle irradiated material after it had passed through the reactors. The camp made this transformation possible by absorbing human strain. A worker might experience Hanford not as a grand technical design, but as a sequence of immediate facts: a bunk, a meal, a job assignment, a truck ride, a badge check, a supervisor's order, another meal, another shift. The extraordinary entered daily life through repetition. The size of the cafeterias, the length of the roads, the number of trains, the scale of the buildings, the guarded boundaries, all of it said that the work mattered, even if the reason remained out of reach. There was also a kind of impermanence built into everything. The Hanford construction camp was not intended to become a permanent civic center like Richland, which was being transformed into a bedroom community for atomic workers and their families. Richland had planning, housing, and the outlines of family life. The construction camp was different. It was a wartime instrument. It existed to gather labor near the job, sustain that labor, and keep the project moving. That difference matters because it shows how the Manhattan Project created more than one kind of secret community. Oak Ridge had neighborhoods, schools, and alphabet houses alongside its plants. Los Alamos would have laboratories, army administration, family housing, and the peculiar address of P.O. Box 1663. Hanford had Richland for many long-term employees and families, but it also had this immense temporary camp, a place that swelled over the old Townsite because the schedule demanded bodies before it demanded permanence. By late 1944, the camp's population and the reservation's construction were reaching their wartime peak together. The human city and the industrial city rose in tandem. The worker camp fed the building sites. The building sites justified the camp. The more roads, rail lines, tanks, reactors, and processing plants were completed, the more Hanford approached the moment when construction would turn into production. That turn is where the scale of the camp begins to narrow into the purpose of the machinery. The roads and railroads did not merely cross empty desert. They led toward the reactors on the Columbia, the fuel fabrication work, and the chemical plants built to extract plutonium from irradiated uranium. Among those reactors, one would become especially important, B reactor, completed in 11 months, the first full-scale plutonium production reactor, and the beginning of Hanford's decisive role in the atomic end of the war. The roads and rail lines that spread across Hanford were never meant to be an end in themselves. They were the arteries of a production system. Workers could see concrete, steel, timber, fencing, utility poles, and heavy equipment. They could see the desert becoming a factory. But the true purpose of that factory was smaller than anything they built. Plutonium, an element measured in grams and pounds, made inside reactors and separated in chemical plants under military secrecy. Hanford's wartime mission was not simply to build. It was to produce plutonium at an industrial scale. Oak Ridge had shown, through X-10, that plutonium could be made in a reactor and sent onward for research. Hanford was the enlargement of that idea into a vast manufacturing landscape. Uranium fuel rods would be prepared, irradiated in nuclear reactors, and then chemically processed so that plutonium could be extracted from the uranium that had gone through the reactor. What sounded, in simplified form, like a sequence of steps required an entire reservation to carry it out. The system was divided across major production zones. In the 300 area, uranium fuel fabrication turned raw material into forms that could be used in the reactors. Along the Columbia River, in the 100 area, the reactors stood where cooling water could be drawn in enormous quantities. Farther away, in the 200 area, the chemical processing plants were built to handle irradiated uranium and separate out the plutonium. Hanford was not one building or one machine. It was a chain of operations stretched across the reservation, with distance itself serving the needs of production, safety, and secrecy. The most famous point in that chain was B Reactor. It was completed in 11 months, an astonishing pace even inside the compressed timetable of the Manhattan Project. It was the first full-scale plutonium production reactor, and it marked the moment when Hanford moved from construction spectacle to nuclear production. The temporary city at the old Hanford Townsite had fed the building effort. Now the work of that city began to take form in graphite, uranium, water systems, control rooms, and concrete. B reactor mattered because it transformed uranium into something the weapons program needed urgently. In basic terms, uranium fuel was placed in the reactor and exposed to neutron activity. During that irradiation, some of the uranium was changed into plutonium. The fuel did not come out as a finished weapon material. It came out intensely transformed and had to move to the next part of the system, where chemical processes would separate the plutonium from the irradiated uranium. This was Hanford's particular contribution to the Manhattan Project, not theoretical physics, not bomb assembly, not enrichment by Calutron or gaseous diffusion, but the mass production and extraction of plutonium. The scale around B reactor helps explain why Hanford had to be so large. A production reactor was not a laboratory pile tucked into a campus building. It required space, water, power, shielding, transport, maintenance, and constant support. The Columbia River was central to the design because reactor operation required cooling water on a scale that only a major river could provide. Hydroelectric power from Grand Coulee and other dams also made the region attractive. The same geography that had supported farms, orchards, river towns, and native traditional use lands was now turned toward a different purpose, feeding an atomic production line. B Reactor was not alone. Hanford workers built 3 nuclear reactors along the Columbia River. These were the world's first 3 production-scale nuclear reactors. Together, they formed the reactor side of the plutonium works. Each was part of the same wartime logic: prepare uranium, irradiate it, move the irradiated fuel onward, and extract plutonium. To a worker assigned to one portion of that system, the task might appear as construction, plumbing, electrical work, hauling, fabrication, maintenance, paperwork, or plant operation. In the full design, each partial task supported a chain that led toward the atomic bomb. The chemical side of Hanford was just as immense. Workers built 3 enormous chemical processing facilities, often described as plutonium extraction plants. These were not small laboratories where chemists leaned over benches. They were industrial buildings designed to process irradiated uranium and recover plutonium through chemical means. Their size reflected both the difficulty of the work and the wartime demand for reliable output. If the reactors made plutonium possible, the processing plants made it usable. This distinction matters. A reactor could create plutonium inside a radiated fuel, but that plutonium remained embedded in highly altered material. Without chemical separation, it could not serve the weapons program. Hanford's mission depended on both halves: the nuclear transformation inside the reactors and the chemical extraction afterward. The production chain was a marriage of physics, engineering, chemistry, and construction labor, carried out under conditions where most workers were not permitted to understand the whole. The fuel fabrication complex completed the basic triangle of Hanford production. Before uranium could be irradiated, it had to be prepared as fuel for the reactors. The 300 area performed that role. From there, the material entered the reactor system along the Columbia. After irradiation, it moved toward the chemical processing plants in the 200 area. The geography of Hanford was therefore a map of process. Each area had a place in the sequence. Each road and rail line helped connect one stage to the next. Each guarded boundary helped keep the purpose hidden from outside view, and often from the workers inside. Over 30 months, Hanford construction had produced 554 buildings, 386 miles of road, 158 miles of railroad, large underground tanks, 3 plutonium extraction plants, and the first 3 production-scale reactors in the world. Those figures can sound like a ledger of wartime accomplishment, but they also reveal the weight of what plutonium production required. The atomic bomb was not made only in a laboratory. It required a hidden industrial region with fabrication plants, reactors, chemical buildings, tanks, rail routes, cafeterias, barracks, houses, power systems, and river water moving through the machinery. B Reactor became the symbol of that hidden region because of what it produced. The plutonium made there was used in the Trinity test in New Mexico's Tularosa Basin and in the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. That connection links the river landscape of Washington to the desert test site and then to the destruction of a Japanese city. At Hanford, the work had been described to many as important war work, urgent and secret. The visible world was one of shifts, badges, buses, cafeterias, construction schedules, and plant operations. The invisible destination of the material ran far beyond the fence. The Trinity test, conducted at 5:30 in the morning, Mountain War Time, on July 16, 1945, depended in part on the plutonium trail that led through Hanford. So did the bomb dropped on Nagasaki? In that sense, B Reactor stands at a crucial intersection in the Manhattan Project's story. Oak Ridge had enriched uranium and produced small quantities of plutonium for research at X-10. Los Alamos had carried out weapons design and assembly work. Hanford provided the industrial plutonium that made the plutonium weapon possible at wartime speed. The achievement was technical, but it was also organizational. Hanford had to coordinate fuel fabrication, reactor operation, chemical separation, waste handling, transport, utilities, and security across a reservation built in haste. The three reactors along the Columbia River did not stand apart from the three chemical processing facilities or the fuel fabrication complex. They were pieces of one purpose, dispersed across a landscape large enough to conceal, protect, and operate them. The distances between areas were part of the design. So were the restricted roads, the military controls, and the silence around the larger mission. For the people living and working there, the result was a strange kind of industrial intimacy. A worker might be close to a vital part of the atomic process and still far from understanding it. Someone could help build a reactor building, lay track, fabricate fuel, maintain equipment, pour concrete, or support the chemical plants without being told that the material moving through the system would be used in a weapon tested at Trinity and dropped on Nagasaki. Hanford's great achievement depended not only on engineering, but on compartmentalization. That is why B reactor cannot be understood only as a machine. It was a product of secrecy, removal, construction speed, river geography, federal authority, and divided knowledge. It was completed in 11 months because the war demanded speed and because the reservation had been organized to remove obstacles. It produced plutonium because Oak Ridge and Los Alamos needed Hanford's scale. It became historic because its output entered the final chain of events that brought the atomic age into public view. Yet inside the fence, that public meaning was still largely hidden. The workers saw pieces. The government held the pattern. The reactors, processing plants, roads, rail lines, tanks, and housing all belonged to one immense design, but the design was not shared equally with the people who made it function. Hanford had become a plutonium works. It had also become one of the clearest examples of how the Manhattan Project could mobilize massive labor around partial knowledge, loyalty, urgency, and silence. By the time Hanford's reactors and chemical plants were in motion, the reservation had become more than a place of construction. It had become a system for controlling knowledge. The same roads that carried workers to job sites also carried them only so far into the larger truth. The same badges and fences that organized movement also divided information. A person might know a valve, a gauge, a payroll office, a rail spur, a cafeteria line, a concrete pour, or a shift schedule. But the project itself remained deliberately larger than the view from any one post. That was not an accident. It was one of Hanford's defining features. The official history of the Hanford site states the matter plainly. Employees knew little to nothing about the work, beyond the belief that they were doing important war work. That sentence captures one of the central contradictions of the Manhattan Project's secret cities. Hanford required vast numbers of people, specialized equipment, heavy industry, careful timing, and disciplined routines. Yet it also required those people not to know too much. The government needed labor at a scale almost impossible to hide, so it hid the meaning instead. At Hanford, this meant that ordinary work could be folded into extraordinary secrecy. A worker might help build a road across the reservation without knowing what final destination mattered most. Another might help lay rail lines that connected construction zones, supply areas, and industrial plants without knowing the full purpose of the materials being moved. Crews might pour concrete for buildings, install utilities, fabricate components, dig trenches, assemble housing, or support food service for a temporary city, while only a small circle understood how those efforts joined into a system for producing plutonium. The geography itself helped enforce the separation. Hanford was not a single compact factory. It was a huge reservation along the Columbia River, with production zones spread across desert space. The 300 area was associated with uranium fuel fabrication. The 100 area along the Columbia River held the reactors. The 200 area was set apart for chemical processing. Workers assigned to one zone did not necessarily understand the work of another. The size of the place made compartmentalization feel natural. Distance became part of the security plan. This was different from secrecy as simple silence. It was secrecy built into the design of labor. The worker did not need to know the entire process to perform a task. Uranium fuel could be fabricated in one area, irradiated in reactors in another, and chemically processed elsewhere, with only certain officials and technical personnel seeing the chain clearly. A person responsible for one link could be loyal, skilled, and essential, while still remaining outside the central explanation. Hanford's construction record shows why this mattered. Over 30 months, workers built 554 buildings, 386 miles of road, 158 miles of railroad, large underground tanks, 3 plutonium extraction plants, and the world's first 3 production-scale nuclear reactors. That kind of work required coordination, but not universal understanding. In fact, the Manhattan Project depended on the difference between coordination and understanding. Schedules, contracts, drawings, guards, foremen, military authority, and operating procedures could coordinate the site. Understanding could be reserved. This was how a massive labor force could be organized around partial knowledge. Each person was given a piece small enough to perform and narrow enough to protect. If questions came, the answer was often not a technical explanation, but a patriotic one. The work was important. The country was at war. The details were not for everyone to know. For many workers, that may have been enough. The United States was fighting a global war, and the urgency of the early 1940s shaped how secrecy was received. Wartime Americans were familiar with rationing, military censorship, troop movements, and official silence. In that climate, not knowing could be interpreted as discipline. Not asking could be treated as loyalty. Hanford turned those habits into an industrial operating principle. But the result was strange. People lived inside an enormous fact before they were allowed to know what it meant. They saw the scale. They saw the food service at the Hanford construction camp, where the official history says more than 50 tons of food were served at every meal and 30,000 donuts were eaten daily. They saw banks, barber and beauty shops, a Sears store, a theater, and cafeterias so large they were described as the size of football fields. They saw a temporary city rise over the old Hanford Townsite, housing nearly 50,000 workers at the peak construction period in late 1944. They saw speed, money, urgency, and control. What many did not see was the destination of it all. The separation between effort and explanation reached into daily life. Richland was transformed from a small agricultural village into a bedroom community for atomic workers and their families. Architect Gustav Albin Persson planned wartime housing, including hundreds of single and multifamily alphabet houses. To live there was to be part of a community created for the project, but not necessarily to understand the project. Homes, schools, roads, and civic routines gave the secret city the appearance of normal life. The fence and the badges reminded residents that normal life had limits. Hanford's workers were not unique in this. They belonged to a broader Manhattan Project pattern. At Oak Ridge, many workers also knew only their own narrow task. Young women operating Calutrons at Y12 separated uranium-23-5 from uranium-23-8, generally without being told the ultimate purpose of their work. At K25, S50, and Y12, different enrichment methods demanded immense labor and electrical power, while knowledge was divided by plant, job, and clearance. At X10, plutonium was produced in small quantities for research and shipped to Los Alamos. The full map of meaning was held above the ordinary worker's line of sight. Hanford extended that pattern on a different industrial scale. Oak Ridge had enriched uranium. Hanford was built to produce plutonium in production quantities. That required reactors, chemical separation, fuel fabrication, tanks, roads, railroads, housing, and an entire support world. But the human method was familiar. Divide the labor, narrow the information, insist on urgency, and wrap the whole enterprise in military authority. This approach created a peculiar kind of community. People were not bound together by shared knowledge of a common goal in the usual civic sense. They were bound by shared discipline around an unknown goal. Their common belief was not a complete understanding of what they were making, but trust that the work mattered. The government asked them to accept that importance without full explanation. Many did. The power of that system lay in its ability to make secrecy ordinary. A guarded gate became part of the commute. A restricted area became part of the landscape. A censored or incomplete explanation became part of employment. People learned where they were allowed to go, what they were allowed to say, and what questions were best left unasked. The atomic fence was not only barbed wire or military patrols. It was also the boundary around conversation. And yet the work itself was real, physical, and exhausting. Compartmentalization did not make labor abstract for the people doing it. It meant that hands, backs, eyes, and routines were attached to purposes withheld from them. Workers moved materials, operated machines, prepared meals, drove vehicles, maintained systems, kept records, guarded entrances, and built structures that supported one of the most secret military projects in American history. They helped create a weapon before they were permitted to understand the weapon. That is why Hanford remains such a sharp example of secret America. It was not hidden because no one was there. It was hidden while tens of thousands were there. Its secrecy was not the absence of people, but the management of what people could know. The project did not avoid community. It built community, then placed that community under rules of silence. The moral weight of that arrangement would become clearer only later, when the hidden purpose entered public history. Reactor produced plutonium used in the Trinity test and in the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. But during the wartime operation, many of the people who made the production system possible were still living inside fragments. Their labor was connected to events of enormous consequence, but the connection was concealed until the government chose to reveal it. Hanford shows how the Manhattan Project solved one of its hardest problems: how to build something vast without making it fully visible. The answer was not only remote geography, though the Columbia River site mattered. It was not only federal power, though the removal of towns and the control of land mattered. It was not only engineering, though reactors and chemical plants mattered. It was the disciplined division of knowledge across an entire working population. In that sense, Hanford was both a factory and a lesson. It proved that an enormous secret could be assembled in public labor if the labor was carefully separated from the explanation. Roads could be built without naming the destination. Reactors could be supported without describing the weapon. Chemical plants could rise while their final military meaning remained guarded. A city could function on loyalty, wages, routine, and silence. But Hanford was only one part of the atomic geography. The plutonium it produced did not become a weapon on the Columbia River. The final design work belonged elsewhere, on a mesa in New Mexico, behind another guarded threshold. There, beyond Santa Fe, a former school would become a laboratory town known simply as the Hill, and another kind of secrecy would take shape among scientists, soldiers, families, passes, and a small office at 109 East Palace Avenue. From Hanford, the atomic trail turned south and inland, away from the Columbia River and toward the high country of northern New Mexico. The plutonium made in Washington would not become a weapon beside the reactors that produced it. That work required another kind of place, smaller than Oak Ridge, less industrial than Hanford, but even more concentrated in its purpose. It required a laboratory hidden inside a town, and a town hidden on a mesa. Los Alamos did not begin as an atomic city. Before the Army arrived, it was known for the Los Alamos Ranch School, a private school for boys set in the Pajarito Plateau, northwest of Santa Fe. Its buildings stood in a landscape of mesas, canyons, pine trees, and mountain air. It was remote, but not unreachable. It was isolated, but close enough to a railroad, roads, and the administrative conveniences of Santa Fe. Those qualities mattered. The Manhattan Project needed secrecy, but secrecy alone was not enough. Scientists, soldiers, technicians, equipment, and families had to get there. They had to be housed. They had to be fed. They had to work under military control without being so cut off that the project could not function. The choice of Los Alamos came after a search. Major John H. Dudley and J. Robert Oppenheimer evaluated possible sites in New Mexico, including Jemez Springs. They were not merely looking for an empty location on a map. The future laboratory had to satisfy several competing demands at once. It needed distance from public attention, room for experimental work, and a setting that could be guarded. It also needed to be made ready quickly, because by late 1942, the Manhattan Project was moving from possibility into construction. Jemez Springs had its attractions, but Oppenheimer favored the mesa occupied by the Los Alamos Ranch School. The reason was not only practical. Oppenheimer knew New Mexico. He had personal ties to the region and understood the character of the high plateau. The mesa offered a natural boundary. Canyons and steep approaches made the place easier to control. Its existing school buildings, though limited, gave the Army a starting point. In a project where weeks mattered, an existing campus could be turned into a military laboratory faster than a town could be created from nothing. On November 25, 1942, the War Department approved the purchase of the Los Alamos Ranch School for $440,000 in 1942 dollars. With that approval, a school became a federal wartime site. A place built around education, discipline, outdoor life, and youth would be transformed into the center of weapons design for the most secret military project in the United States, apartment. The change was abrupt. The old identity of the Mesa did not vanish all at once, but it was overtaken. Barracks, laboratories, offices, fences, checkpoints, and temporary housing began to define the place. The name Los Alamos remained, but inside the project, it became something else as well. It became the Hill, a phrase that carried both geography and secrecy. To be sent to the Hill was to enter a controlled world above Santa Fe, a place that appeared on maps less clearly than it existed in military orders, passes, and coded routines. Unlike Oak Ridge and Hanford, Los Alamos was not primarily an industrial production site. It did not require the same vast factory scale as uranium enrichment in Tennessee or plutonium production in Washington. Its purpose was research, design, calculation, testing, and assembly. The work demanded physicists, chemists, engineers, metallurgists, machinists, explosives experts, soldiers, clerks, drivers, cooks, and families drawn into a single, restricted community. The fence around Los Alamos enclosed not only machinery, but intellect. It enclosed conversations, chalkboards, equations, classified reports, and the human pressure of trying to turn material from other secret sites into a usable weapon. That made the entrance to Los Alamos especially important. The project could not simply post a sign in Santa Fe directing new arrivals to a secret laboratory. People had to be received quietly, identified, processed, and sent onward. For many of them, the first human face of Los Alamos was not on the Mesa at all. It was in Santa Fe at 109 East Palace Avenue. The address looked modest, almost ordinary. Behind it stood one of the most unusual thresholds in wartime America. New arrivals came through Santa Fe with orders, uncertainty, and often very little explanation. At 109 East Palace Avenue, Dorothy Scarrett McKibben issued passes and directed them toward the Mesa. She became known as the gateway to Los Alamos, not because she guarded the whole project by force, but because she helped translate military secrecy into human movement. A person could arrive by train, step into the old city of Santa Fe, find that office, and from there be absorbed into a world that officially did not want to be found. McKibben's role mattered because secret cities were not sustained by fences alone. They required offices, clerks, instructions, documents, habits, and people who could make confusion seem orderly. New scientists and staff did not always know what they were entering. Families arrived with children and luggage. Recruits had to be told where to go without being told too much. Passes had to be issued. Transportation had to be arranged. The road from Santa Fe to the Hill was not only a physical route. It was a passage from ordinary identity into classified existence. In Oak Ridge, workers encountered secrecy through badges, plants, housing assignments, and compartmentalized jobs. At Hanford, secrecy was spread across a vast reservation where thousands built and operated pieces of a plutonium system without seeing the full design. At Los Alamos, secrecy had a different texture. The community was smaller, the work more intellectually concentrated, and the boundary between home and laboratory unusually thin. The same Mesa held military administration, scientific debate, family quarters, and the developing designs of atomic weapons. A person might walk from a domestic errand into a classified discussion, from a crowded residence into a restricted technical area, from the routines of a small town into the pressures of a weapon laboratory. The physical setting reinforced that separation. Los Alamos sat above the surrounding country, reached from Santa Fe by controlled approaches. The word hill made the place sound almost informal, but the informality concealed a hard fact. Access was controlled by the United States Army. To be on the hill, one needed authorization. To leave or enter, one moved through a system of passes and permission. The landscape helped the military do what fences did elsewhere. Canyons and mesa edges became part of the security architecture. The purchase of the ranch school was therefore more than a real estate transaction. It was the conversion of geography into secrecy. The War Department did not only buy buildings and land. It bought isolation, altitude, distance, and a ready-made nucleus for a closed community. The price, $440,000 and $1942, marked the formal transfer. The deeper transformation came in what followed, the turning of a school mesa into a scientific garrison. Oppenheimer's preference for Los Alamos also shaped the social character of the wartime laboratory. This was not an anonymous factory town planned for tens of thousands. It became a place where leading scientists, military officers, technical workers, and families lived under pressure in close quarters. The work demanded collaboration, but the setting demanded silence. People were brought together so that ideas could move quickly, then surrounded by rules meant to keep those ideas from moving beyond the fence. That contradiction defined life on the hill from the beginning. Los Alamos had to be open enough internally for science to proceed, but closed enough externally to protect the project. It needed discussion and secrecy, urgency and routine, brilliance and bureaucracy. It needed men and women to arrive from universities, military posts, and other laboratories, then accept that their address, their mail, their movements, and even parts of their personal lives would be absorbed into the machinery of the project. The road through 109 East Palace Avenue made that absorption visible. Dorothy Scarrett McKibben's office stood between two worlds, Santa Fe, with its streets, hotels, stations, and public life, and the Mesa, where names, destinations, and purposes became restricted. Each pass issued there was a small act in the creation of a secret city. Each direction given toward the hill helped populate a place that had been chosen precisely because it could disappear from ordinary view. By late 1942, then, Los Alamos had been selected, purchased, and set on its path. Major John H. Dudley's search, Oppenheimer's judgment, the rejected possibility of Jemmy's Springs, the War Department's approval, and the quiet administrative gateway in Santa Fe all belong to the same story. The atomic laboratory did not simply appear in the mountains. It was chosen, bought, guarded, staffed, and routed through a narrow human doorway. And once people crossed that doorway, secrecy followed them into the smallest parts of daily life. The hill would need not only laboratories and passes, but addresses, mail, households, births, and records that could exist without revealing too much. In Los Alamos, even ordinary domestic facts had to be made to fit the hidden geography of the war. The hill had been chosen because it was hard to reach, hard to see, and easy to control. But once Los Alamos became more than a former ranch school, secrecy had to do something more complicated than guard a laboratory. It had to make room for ordinary life. It had to govern meals, mail, marriage, pregnancy, errands, friendships, and the small records by which a person proves where they have been. That is where one of the strangest details of wartime Los Alamos appears. P.O. Box 1663. During the Manhattan Project, Los Alamos used P.O. Box 1663 in Santa Fe as its central mailing address. On paper, this meant that letters did not openly announce the existence or location of the weapons laboratory on the Mesa. Mail could move through Santa Fe without naming the hidden town in the mountains. A civilian world of envelopes, postmarks, family updates, and official correspondence was folded into the military geography of concealment. The detail is small, but it carries the whole contradiction of Los Alamos. The project needed a place where scientists and technicians could design atomic weapons. It also needed a place where people could live long enough to do that work. The mail had to arrive. Families had to be contacted. Children were born. Records had to be made. Yet every ordinary function had to pass through a system built to reveal as little as possible. The Atomic Heritage Foundation states that babies born at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project had P.O. Box 1663 listed as their birthplace on birth certificates. A post office box, not a town. A mailing address, not a landscape. For those children, the secrecy of the war entered the first official line of identity. That fact is almost surreal, but it was not accidental. Los Alamos was not supposed to be a normal address. It was a military-controlled community serving a hidden research mission. New arrivals had often passed first through 109 East Palace Avenue in Santa Fe, where Dorothy Scarrett McKibben issued passes and directed people up toward the mesa known as the Hill. From the beginning, then, entry into Los Alamos was mediated by paperwork, personal screening, and controlled movement. The address system extended that same logic into domestic life. A place can be hidden on a map and still be crowded with human needs. That was the challenge of Los Alamos. Oak Ridge had shown how an entire city could rise around uranium enrichment, while many workers knew only their assigned task. Hanford had shown how an enormous plutonium production reservation could turn displaced land into reactors, rail lines, chemical plants, and a construction camp of nearly 50,000 workers. Los Alamos was different in scale and purpose, but it shared the same central feature. The war effort had built a community that could not fully explain itself. On the hill, secrecy did not remain at the laboratory door. It shaped how people were known. It shaped what could be written down. It shaped how families explained their location to relatives elsewhere. A husband or wife might live in a community where the daily rhythm included housing, meals, children, and conversation, while the reason for the community's existence remained restricted, classified, and guarded. The town existed because of weapons research, but it also had to sustain households. That contrast made Los Alamos one of the most intimate of the secret cities. At Oak Ridge, the enormous plants at Y12, K25, and S50 could dwarf the individual worker. At Hanford, the distances between the 300 area, the 100 area, and the 200 area expressed the industrial scale of plutonium production. Los Alamos compressed the contradiction. A family could be living within reach of some of the most consequential scientific work of the war, while still navigating ordinary questions of mail, births, permissions, and belonging. The phrase P.O. Box 1663 therefore becomes more than an administrative convenience. It was a mask, but also a bridge. It allowed Los Alamos to connect with the outside world without naming itself too clearly. It gave the hidden town a public-facing point of contact. It let letters travel into and out of a place whose actual purpose could not be written plainly. And yet the mask could not erase the people behind it. Every letter had a sender, a recipient, a waiting household. Every birth certificate marked a real child born into a community that officially blurred its own location. The paperwork of Los Alamos tried to protect the secret, but it also preserved evidence of how deeply the secret entered daily life. This was the domestic side of compartmentalization. In the plants and laboratories, compartmentalization meant that workers often knew only their own part of the job. In community life, it meant that identity itself could be narrowed and redirected. People could live in Los Alamos, work at Los Alamos, give birth at Los Alamos, and still find that the public record pointed to a post office box in Santa Fe. The effect was not simply bureaucratic. It changed the feeling of place. A normal town announces itself through addresses, signs, schools, businesses, local institutions, and records. A secret town must perform normal life while refusing normal visibility. Los Alamos had to be both a home and a withheld fact. It had to hold families together while preventing information from spreading outward. It had to create a community strong enough to support intense weapons research, yet obscure enough to remain hidden inside the war. This is why the domestic details matter. They show that the Manhattan Project's secrecy was not confined to guards, fences, and classified documents. It reached into the nursery, the mailbox, and the birth certificate. It shaped the official answer to one of the simplest questions a person can ask: where were you born? At the same time, those details reveal the pressure placed on ordinary people inside the atomic fence. The residents of Los Alamos were not living in an abstract laboratory. They were living in a wartime settlement where the routines of family life existed beside the development of weapons. The same hidden community that needed a central mailing address also contained research sites where the design problems of atomic bombs were being worked out. The same mesa that required passes and controlled entry also required domestic arrangements that could make life continue. By 1945, that hidden life was moving toward a point of revelation. Work at Los Alamos connected back to the uranium efforts at Oak Ridge and the plutonium production at Hanford. Material, knowledge, and design converged on the mesa. The secrecy that had covered mail and movement also covered the purpose of the entire system until the weapon itself could be tested. P.O. Box 1663 reminds us that before the world knew the name Los Alamos, people were already living there under conditions that made even their address part of the war. The hill was not only a place of equations, explosives, and restricted laboratories. It was also a place of families and records, of children whose official birthplace could be written as a box number in Santa Fe. The atomic fence, in other words, did not stop at the edge of the technical area. It enclosed the ordinary. It made home life part of the secret. And as the work moved toward the desert morning of July 16, 1945, the hidden city behind Santa Fe carried both sides of its identity at once, a community trying to live normally and a weapons laboratory approaching the moment when its secret would become visible in fire. By the time Los Alamos moved toward the desert morning of July 16, 1945, the secret cities had already done most of what they had been built to do. Oak Ridge had separated uranium behind guarded roads in East Tennessee. Hanford had turned the Columbia River landscape into an industrial plutonium works. Los Alamos had drawn those materials, calculations, and designs into a weapon laboratory on the mesa. For years, the fence had hidden the purpose from many of the people inside it. It had broken the project into small tasks, small rooms, small permissions. A worker might watch a gauge, operate a machine, file a form, drive a truck, cook meals, pour concrete, type reports, patrol a gate, or assemble equipment without knowing how the separate pieces connected. That was not a flaw in the system. It was one of the system's central protections. But at 5:30 in the morning, Mountain War time, on July 16, 1945, the secret could no longer remain only a set of compartments. In New Mexico's Tularosa Basin, the Trinity test brought the work into the open, at least for those cleared to witness it. The device tested there was the product of a chain that stretched across the secret geography of the war. It depended on the plutonium production system at Hanford, on the research and assembly work at Los Alamos, and on a national mobilization that had already changed places and lives far from the test site itself. The test did not erase the fences. It did not suddenly make the whole project public, but it marked a threshold. Before Trinity, the Manhattan Project could still be understood by many of its workers as urgent, classified war work whose final purpose was kept out of reach. After Trinity, and especially after the world learned what atomic weapons had done, that distance began to collapse. The revelation came unevenly. Some people knew a great deal. Many knew almost nothing. In Oak Ridge, workers who had spent months or years inside the Clinton Engineer Works had helped produce enriched uranium without being told the final destination of their labor. At Y-12, young women operating Calutrons had followed training, watched instruments, adjusted controls, and repeated their routines with discipline. At K-25, workers had helped operate a vast gaseous diffusion plant whose scale alone suggested importance, even when its purpose remained hidden. At S-50, another enrichment method joined the same urgent stream. At Hanford, employees had built and operated a plutonium production system on a scale the world had never seen. The official history of the Hanford site describes workers who knew little to nothing beyond the belief that they were doing important war work. They lived near reactors, chemical processing areas, fuel fabrication work, rail lines, roads, cafeterias, barracks, and a construction camp that had risen over the old Hanford Townsite. Many had no complete map of what their labor meant. At Los Alamos, the knowledge was more concentrated, but secrecy still shaped the community. The Hill had its laboratories and technical areas, but also its families, mail, children, and official records. P.O. Box 1663 had helped hide a town in plain administrative sight. Even there, where the weapon was designed, the story was divided by clearance, role, and responsibility. Trinity connected those divided worlds. It showed that the secret cities were not only hidden towns or unusual wartime factories. They were parts of a single machine built to produce a new kind of destructive power. The fire in the Tularosa Basin made visible what the fences had kept abstract. That is one of the hardest truths in the history of the Manhattan Project's secret cities. Many workers did not experience the moral weight of the work until after they learned what their hidden labor had produced. During the war, secrecy had allowed people to serve without full knowledge. Afterward, knowledge arrived with shock. The same discipline that had made the project possible had also delayed understanding. The numbers alone suggest the scale of that concealed mobilization. According to the Department of Energy, the Manhattan Project employed about 130,000 workers at its peak. By the end of the war, it had spent about $2.2 billion. Those figures describe more than an engineering program. They describe a temporary nation within the nation, guarded, funded, censored, and accelerated by war. But the cost cannot be measured only in dollars or employment totals. Oak Ridge required the purchase of more than 55,000 acres in East Tennessee and the transformation of a rural valley and ridge landscape into a fenced atomic city. Hanford required the removal of residents from White Bluffs, Hanford, Richland, and smaller communities, while area tribes were barred from returning to traditional use lands. Los Alamos required the conversion of a school mesa into a military laboratory town, entered through passes and a quiet office at 109 East Palace Avenue in Santa Fe. Inside those places, ordinary life continued. People married, raised children, stood in cafeteria lines, waited for housing, rode buses, wrote letters, and worked shifts. But the ordinariness was never separate from the secrecy. The fence did not simply protect machines. It reorganized daily life around hidden purpose. After the war, the secret cities did not disappear. They changed. Some facilities were demolished, some preserved, some adapted, and some remained inside active federal reservations. The story entered museums, oral histories, national memory, and public debate. It also remained physically difficult to reach in many places. On November 10, 2015, Manhattan Project National Historical Park was officially established after a memorandum of agreement between the Department of the Interior and the Department of Energy. The park does not turn the entire atomic landscape into an open museum. Instead, it interprets selected places connected to Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos, while acknowledging that much of this history unfolded on lands still governed by security, contamination concerns, continuing federal missions, or limited access. That arrangement is fitting in a sober way. The history itself is not fully open and simple. It is preserved in fragments: a building, a reactor, a former laboratory, a town plan, a gatehouse, a road, a mailing address, a memory of displacement, a worker's testimony, a machine room, a fence line. Some Manhattan Project places remain on secure Department of Energy reservations with limited or no public access. That includes plutonium-producing complexes at Hanford, uranium-enrichment facilities at Oak Ridge, and weapons research facilities at Los Alamos. Even now, the landscape retains boundaries. Visitors may be able to approach parts of the story, but not all of it. Some doors remain closed because the work continued beyond the war. Some remain closed because the materials and histories inside them are dangerous. Some remain closed because the atomic age did not end when the first wartime project ended. And so the secret cities leave us with a contradiction that has run through this entire story. They were built to be hidden, but they changed the world in ways that could not be hidden. They were filled with ordinary people, but directed toward an extraordinary and terrible purpose. They depended on scientific brilliance and industrial coordination, but also on removal, segregation, censorship, and compartmentalized labor. They were wartime places, yet their consequences reached far beyond the war. At Trinity, the hidden work became visible in fire. Afterward, the people behind the fence had to understand their own past differently. The city they had known as a job, a home, a barracks, a laboratory, or a construction camp was also part of the beginning of the atomic age. Today, Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos remain names with more than one meaning. They are communities, federal sites, historic places, and symbols. They remind us that secrecy can build not only weapons but whole ways of living around what cannot be said. They remind us that national projects are experienced not only by leaders and scientists, but by operators, guards, clerks, cooks, engineers, families, displaced residents, and workers whose hands touched only one small part of a much larger design. The atomic fence was never just a line on the ground. It was a system of knowledge and silence. It enclosed landscapes, labor, and ordinary days. And when the secret finally broke into the open, it left behind places that still ask to be read carefully, not as ruins of a distant war, but as American landscapes where power, secrecy, science, and memory still meet.